الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده اللهم صل على محمد كلما ذكره الذاكرون وصل على محمد كلما غفل عن ذكره الغافلون. The last hadith that was covered last week was the hadith in which Rasulullah ﷺ, he taught us one dua, إِذَا اسْتَجَدَّ ثَوْبًا, whenever Nabi Sallallahu would wear a new pair of garment or new piece of clothing, he would recite the following dua: اللهم لك الحمد كما كسوتنيه أسألك خيره وخير ما صنع له وأعوذ بك من شره وشر ما صنع له. All of these duas can be found in the daily dua books. Generally, most of these books that cover and they have these duas. Apart from this, regarding new clothing, one narration in Abu Dawood has mentioned the following narration: من لبس ثوبا جديدا فقال الحمد لله الذي كساني. A person who has a new piece of clothing and he recites the following dua, slightly different: الحمد لله الذي كساني هذا ورزقنيه من غير حول ولا قوة غفر الله له ما تقدم من ذنبه. Whoever recites the following dua after wearing the new piece of clothing: الحمد لله الذي كساني هذا ورزقنيه من غير حول ولا قوة غفر الله له ما تقدم من ذنب, Allah will forgive all his previous sins. So the dua is very short. الحمد لله الذي كساني هذا ورزقنيه من غير حول ولا قوة. Person recites this upon wearing a new piece of clothing, Allah will forgive all his previous sins. And in other narration it is found, when a person who wears a new piece of clothing, فيسن له أن يقول, if you see somebody else wearing a new piece of clothing, then you should say to them, البس جديدا وعش حميدا ومت شهيدا. Wear new clothing, وعش حميدا, live a life, praiseworthy life, ومت شهيدا, and die in a state that you are a martyr. And this has been narrated in Tirmidhi. And also narrated from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, when they would see another person wearing new clothing, they would say to that person who is wearing the new clothing, Tubli wa yukhlifu Allahu ta'ala. Tubli wa yukhlifu Allahu ta'ala. And another narration, Abli wa akhliqi. And this means Tubli, implying Tubli comes from the word that may these clothes they grow old, meaning may you outlive these clothes. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prolong your life and give you a long life. And وَيُخْلِفُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow you to outgrow these clothing, the pair on that new piece of clothes. Then the next hadith in this chapter, وبه قال حدثنا هشام بن يونس الكوفي قال حدثنا القاسم بن مالك المزني عن الجريري عن أبي نضرة عن أبي سعيد الخضري عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم نحوه. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anh has also narrated a very similar hadith from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding this matter of the dua of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The next hadith, وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا معاذ بن هشام قال حدثنا أبي عن أبي قتادة عن أنس بن مالك قال كان أحب الثياب إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يلبسه الحبرة. It is narrated from Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu that the most beloved piece of clothing to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore, was the al-hibara, which has been translated as the Yemeni printed sheet. This hadith apparently seems to contradict the first hadith in the chapter, in which Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the most beloved clothing to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was narrated to was the qamis, the traditional qamis. And this hadith that we find that the narration where Nabi sallallahu Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu narrates that the most beloved clothing which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam he wore was the al-hibara, the Yemeni printed sheets. The ulama explain that there was not much difference, that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam he loved the qamis very much, And also at the same time, he loved this Yemeni printed sheet, al-hibara, very much also. Another explanation is that from the ordinary piece of clothing, normal clothing that was worn, the qamis was the most beloved to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And for the outer covering to be worn on top of the qamis, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam loved the hibara, the Yemeni printed sheet, the most. And some scholars have mentioned that the color of this hibara, the Yemeni printed sheet, was green, and this will be the color of the clothes that a person wears in paradise. وبه قال حدثنا محمود بن غيلان قال حدثنا عبد الرزاق قال حدثنا سفيان عن أون بن أبي جحيفة عن أبيه قال رأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعليه حلة حمراء كأني أنظر إلى بريق ساقيه. It has been narrated from Awn ibn Abi Juhayfa radiallahu anhu, from his father Abu Juhayfa, that he mentions that I saw Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam وعليه حلة حمراء, and he was wearing a pair of red clothing. Hulla refers to two pieces of clothing, one of the upper garment and one of the lower garment. So one pair of clothing. And today, example, a person is wearing a suit. So you have the blazer and you have the trousers. So Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was wearing two pieces of clothing, a hulla. كأني أنظر إلى بريق ساقيه. And at the time of the narrating this hadith, the Sahabi is mentioning, as if I can see, I still remember the luster of the feet of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the beauty of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That image is still captured in my mind. قال سفيان أراها حبرة. Sufyan, he mentions that I think that the color of this piece of clothing was hibara. Again, the printed sheet was a printed sheet. And why is it that Sufyan rahimahullah, he mentions that uraha hibara? I consider this to be a red printed sheet, because some scholars have disliked that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioned that to wear completely bright red clothing was disliked by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and some have mentioned that he has been prohibited for men to wear red colored clothing, pure red colored clothing. Yet there is a difference of opinion in this matter. The Hanafi scholars have various opinions that before a person who wears such clothing, you should consult the ulama, the scholars. Maulana Gangohi rahmatullahi alayhi has mentioned a few times in his fatwa that it is permissible for men to wear red patterned garments. But from a point of taqwa and piety, وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ, and to abstain from this is better. And وبه قال حدثنا علي بن خشرم قال حدثنا عيسى بن يونس عن إسرائيل عن أبي إسحاق عن البراء بن عازم قال ما رأيت أحدا من الناس أحسن في حلة حمراء من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن كانت جمته لتضرب قريبا من منكبيه. Bara ibn Azim radiallahu anhu, he mentions that, he narrates, I never saw anyone more beautiful in a red suit of clothing than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in a pair of red clothing than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in telling us of the beauty of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in كانت جمته لتضرب قريبا من منكبيه, and the hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reaching up to the shoulders. Now this hadith was mentioned earlier on, but because of the fact that he mentions that the clothing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that's why he has been mentioned here again. The next hadith. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال أنبأنا عبد الرحمن بن مهدي قال حدثنا عبيد الله بن إياد عن أبيه عن أبي رمثة قال ما رأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعليه بردان أخضران. Abu Rimtha radiallahu anhu, he mentions that I saw Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was wearing two green colored sheets, وعليه, and he was clothed and he was covered in two green colored sheets. So again, showing what type of clothing Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wore and how the color green. And some of the scholars, they mentioned that the entire cloth, it was not purely green, but it had green stripes. Again, in the hadith when it was mentioned that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wore red colored clothing, it indicates, scholars have mentioned that it means that there were red stripes on the clothing of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Similarly here, there were green stripes on the clothes of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. وبه قال حدثنا عبد بن حميد قال حدثنا عفان بن مسلم قال حدثنا عبد الله بن حسان العنبري عن جدتيه لحيبة وعليبة عن قيلة بنت مخرمة قالت رأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعليه أسمان مليتين كانتا بزعفران وقد نفرته في الحديث قصة طويلة. Qayla bint Makhrama radiallahu anha, she narrates that I saw Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam wa alayhi, and in such a state that he was wearing wa alayhi asmalu mulayyataini, that he was wearing two old lungis. Lungi referring to that traditional Indian people that wear the lower piece of garment that had been dyed mulayyatain kanata biza'faranin, that had been dyed of the saffron color. But وَقَدْ نَفَضَتْهُ, there was no sign left of saffron on that clothing. وَفِي الْحَدِيثِ, and in the hadith there is a long story regarding this. But here that wearing of saffron has been prohibited, clothes of the saffron color have been prohibited in our hadith. Hadith prohibits the using of clothing dyed with saffron. That's why in this hadith it has been pointed out that the clothing وَعَلَيْهِ أَسْمَانُ مُلَيَّتَيْنِ كَانَتَا بِزَعْفَرَانٍ وَقَدْ نَفَضَتْهُ, but that clothing, the dye of the saffron had faded away and there was almost no sign left of it. And after this, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wore that piece of clothing, not whilst the effect of the saffron was on the clothing of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He had worn it after the effect of the saffron had faded away. Another thing in the hadith, وَعَلَيْهِ أَسْمَانُ مُلَيَّتَيْنِ, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was wearing two old sheets of clothing. This is a sign of humility of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, not all the time he wore new clothing, but times Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would also wear clothes that were old. And wearing these type of clothing, it leads a person to humility and saves a person from being arrogant and saves a person from the pride and arrogance. Next hadith. وبه قال حدثنا قتيبة بن سعيد قال حدثنا بشر بن المفضل عن عبد الله بن عثمان بن خثيم عن سعيد بن جبير عن ابن عباس قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عليكم بالبياض من الثياب يلبسها أحياؤكم وكفنوا فيها موتاكم فإنها من خير ثيابكم. Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, you should choose white clothing. So here, explicitly in this hadith, it has been mentioned what color of clothing a person should wear. عليكم بالبياض من الثياب, they should choose white clothing. يلبسها أحياؤكم, and the living should wear it. The people who are alive, they should wear this clothing. وكفنوا فيها موتاكم, and enshroud and cover the deceased in white. فإنها من خير ثيابكم, because this is the best clothing. And in other narrations, we find that the Sahaba, they mentioned clearly that they came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a state where Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was wearing white clothing. The reason for this will be mentioned in the next hadith. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا عبد الرحمن بن مهدي قال حدثنا سفيان عن حبيب بن أبي ثابت عن ميمون بن أبي شبيب عن سمرة بن جندب قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم البسوا البياض إنها أطهر وأطيب وكفنوا فيها موتاكم. That Samurah ibn Jundub radiallahu anhu, he mentions that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, you should ilbasul bayad, you should wear white. Why? The reason, فإنها أطهر, because it is more pure. Scholars, they explain this. When a person who has white clothing and any dirt that was to get on his clothes, can immediately be noticed. Whereas in colored clothing, a person, he might get some impurity or something else on his clothes and it may go unnoticed. It's why a person who wears white, that clothing will keep this person more pure. فَإِنَّهَا أَطْهَرُ, and it is more pure. وَأَطْيَبُ, and it is better that this clothing, white, should be worn. وَكَفِّنُوا فِيهَا مَوْتَاكُمْ, and then thereafter Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he instructs the Sahabi and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum that he should clothe the deceased in white. This is why we see when a person, all the time, more or less all the time, when a person, the time of the burial, a person passes away, and the time after the ghusl has been given, then the person is always wrapped in piece of white clothing. The coffin is always white. White, this is the amal and the hadith of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So a lot of the time we see that this latter part of the hadith we act upon, وَكَفِّنُوا فِيهَا مَوْتَاكُمْ, but the first part of the hadith, even when a person is alive, not just for the deceased, even us, we should try and adopt, we should try and wear white clothing. Like we mentioned in the previous hadith, يَلْبَسْهَا أَحْيَاؤُكُمْ, that the living, whilst we're alive, we should try and wear white clothing. The next hadith, وبه قال حدثنا أحمد بن منيع قال حدثنا يحيى بن زكريا بن أبي زائدة قال حدثنا أبي عن موسى بن شيبة عن صفية بنت شيبة عن عائشة قالت خرج رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ذات غداة وعليه مرط من شعر أسود. Aisha radiallahu anha, she mentions the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he left in the morning, ذات غداة, one morning, and at the time وعليه مرط, and he was wearing a sheet of black hair, min sha'rin aswad. So at times Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he also wore black clothing. So this entire chapter, I mentioned this at the end. In the next hadith, ومن قال حدثنا يوسف بن عيسى قال حدثنا وكيع قال حدثنا يونس بن أبي إسحاق عن أبيه عن الشعبي عن أروة بن المغيرة بن شعبة عن أبيه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لبس جبة رومية ضيقة الكمين. That Nabi sallallahu Mughira ibn Shu'bah radiallahu anhu, he mentions from his father that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore a Rumi jubba, or Rumi attributed to Rome, Rumi jubba ضيقة الكمين, and the point was the sleeves of which were very narrow, tight. So this was also worn by Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for this chapter was regarding the clothing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there are many hadith that you will find regarding the thiyab of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in terms of permissibility, what to wear, there is a lot of scope. A person can wear a variety of different pieces of clothing. There's not very few restrictions in the chapter of clothing. Number one, the satar of a person should always be covered. That those parts which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instructed to be covered, they should always remain covered. And there are few prohibitions, very few. That's men should not wear silk, clothes made from silk, and this is just generally, we understand the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wore a qamis, he wore the jubba, he wore different pieces of clothing. You should try and adapt the clothing. One, walibas, in the Quran Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions walibasu taqwa dhalika khayr, the clothing of piety, the clothing of the pious people. This is better for them. But if not, any clothing that covers the satar, does not expose the body part, this may be worn. As long as it closes the satar and does not expose one's body parts, then this may be worn. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to understand the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and give us attachment with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also allow us to follow in his footsteps. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Although there is no fixed piece of clothing to be worn in this chapter, a person may wear, that is mentioned multiple times, as long as he covers the satar and he complies with the teachings of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But remember the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned a person who resembles a nation will be amongst them. That if you resemble the pious people, the clothing of the pious people, the clothing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the clothing of the pious people, then we hope from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will resurrect us with these people. And if their abode is in paradise, then we make dua to Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala join us with them in paradise as well. Ameen. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Inshallah, from here, continue from the next chapter next week. Assalamu alaikum.